My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to today's event with ROB REICH, Mehran Sahami, and Jeremy M. Weinstein presenting System Error, where big tech went wrong and how to reboot it. Today's event is part of our Ethics in Your World series, presented with Harvard University's Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our spring season is on the way, and you don't want to miss out on our lineup. Make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to purchase a copy of System Error, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual series wouldn't be possible. You also have the option for closed captioning during this talk. If you would like to see closed captions on your screen, click the CC button on your toolbar. Thank you again for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I have the joy of introducing today's speakers. ROB REICH is a philosopher, the director of Stanford University Center for Ethics and Society, co-director of the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society, and associate director of its new Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. He is the author of Just Giving: Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better. Mehran Sahami was recruited to Google in its startup days and is one of the inventors of the email spam filtering technology. He holds the James and Eleanor Chesborough Professorship in Engineering. He is one of the instructors of Stanford's massive introductory computer programming course taken by nearly 1,500 students per year. Jeremy M. Weinstein went to Washington with President Obama in 2009. A key staffer in the White House, he foresaw how new technologies might remake the relationship between governments and citizens, and launched Obama's Open Government Partnership. He was a deputy to Samantha Power and is now a professor of political science at Stanford. Today, they are discussing System Error. In no more than a blink of an eye, and naive optimism around technology's liberating potential has given way to a dystopian obsession with biased algorithms, surveillance, capitalism, and a job-displacing robots. Yet too few of us see any alternative to accepting the onward march of technology. We have simply accepted a technological future designed for us by technologists, and a future that venture capitalisms who fund them, and the politicians who give them free rein. It doesn't need to be this way. System Error exposes the root of our current predicament, how big tech's relentless focus on optimism is driving a future that reinforces discrimination, erodes privacy, and displaces workers and pollutes the information we get. Without further ado, I am so excited to turn things over to our speakers. Rob, Mehran, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you giving your time and being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Audrey, and to Harvard Bookstore and to the Safra Center at Harvard for the invitation to join and to be a part of this event. My name's Rob. I'm the philosopher of the lot of our co-authors, and we're going to do something perhaps a little different than the kinds of online events that we've done over the course of the past couple months that the book has been out. We're going to have a conversation amongst the three of us, and I'm going to sort of kick off with the questions, and we'll rotate around a bit of the questions. So this is as interactive as possible amongst the three of us. And then after about a half hour or so, we'll invite the audience in for questions. And we really look forward to that portion of the exchange. So, you know, as Audrey introduced the book and gave you a short overview of it, you could get the impression, even in the absence of hearing the introduction, that the sky is falling. The things that big tech has delivered to us in the forms of the apps and the platforms and the devices that we use on a daily basis had so much optimistic potential a decade ago, and now seem to be hijacking our attention, addicting us to our screens, polluting misinformation and disinformation into the wider information environment, and rotting democracy from within. This is the dystopian moment we find ourselves in. Jeremy, I want to give you a chance just to start off by sharing a bit about the big picture about the book. What we wrote competes with a massive media onslaught of stories about big tech and all of its badness. And so, I want to share a little bit, I want us to share a little bit about, how we think in this book, System Error, we want to move beyond this optimism, pessimism, binary frame. So Jeremy, why don't you start off with a little bit about the book?
Great, and great to be with everyone here at Harvard Bookstore and in our online and virtual environment. I guess I'd say if you're reading the newspaper today, you might get one of two frames about the moment that we're in with technology. Well, one frame that you might get is that there are particular technologies that are deeply harmful, that are causing all sorts of negative consequences for society, and you might put Facebook and its social media platform at the top of that list, or Twitter because of the ways in which Twitter has been weaponized, both against people of color or against the health of our electoral system. Another frame that you might get is that the problem that we have is a set of bad founders. Founders like Mark Zuckerberg, these are folks who get hauled into Washington, D.C., the finger is wagged at them. Why have you made the choices that you've made? And so that's a frame that's about founders, and it's a frame that's about particular technologies. Where our book really begins is recognizing that some of these harmful consequences that we see of technologies are best really understood as a set of social externalities, that we've got tremendous innovation that's happening in the private sector. It's creating extraordinary benefits that improve our lives in so many ways. But often there are a set of social consequences, and those social consequences haven't really been accounted for in the architecture of the market itself, in the design of the products. And so when we think about these social externalities, the question is, why do they keep being generated and not responded to? It's not about a particular company, or it's not about a particular founder. It's about a set of three systemic drivers that we focus on. Driver number one is what we call the optimization mindset. This is the orientation that is baked into the engineering and computer science profession that really seeks to achieve optimal ways of pursuing a particular objective. And that framework for thinking about the world has a whole bunch of risks associated with it. One, it's a means to an end, and it doesn't say anything about the worthiness of the end in itself, but often also in trying to achieve a particular end, what you're optimizing for is distant in some important ways from what you're actually trying to achieve in the world, because optimization demands quantification, demands measurement in some way. And so this optimization mindset, when you combine it with the obsession with scale that the venture capital industry drives, this not only the network effects that come from technology, but the need to dominate markets quickly, turns an effort in optimization that may prioritize some values over other values into a choice that affects all of us, and affects all of us in very significant ways. And if you add to that then what we call the deliberate indifference of our political class to the effects of technology, recognizing that politicians created a regulatory oasis around big tech in 1995 and have left big tech largely untethered and unchecked for 25 years, you understand why we're in a moment where technologists are doing extraordinary things that have extraordinary benefits, but also really significant social harms. And so the book is about diagnosing those systemic drivers and thinking about, when you understand this as a system problem, as opposed to a problem of an individual technology or of bad founders, what are the kinds of steps that we can take to address those systemic drivers?
Great. All right. So with that as just a simple introduction to the frame of the book, the basic message of the book, Mehran, I want to just get a little personal for a second here, because as Audrey introduced you, You got your PhD from Stanford in computer science. I don't know exactly when, but 20 or so years ago. And then you spent a decade in the early days at Google before returning to campus. Since this is being co-hosted by the Safra Center at Harvard, I feel like it's a good chance to mention to all of the listeners here that Mehran is the most popular teacher of undergraduates at Stanford University, teaches the Introduction to Computer Science course for the past decade. And an astonishing statistic to share with everyone is that Mehran has personally instructed something in the neighborhood of 50 or 60% of the past decade of Stanford undergraduates who have enrolled in Introduction to Computer Science. So 10 years at Google and then the past 10 years or so at Stanford. Did you see when you were back at Google in those early days, the days where there was much more optimism about the effects of technology, any of these problems that we've now identified in the book and tried to chart a path forward from?
Well, thanks, Rob, for the overly generous introduction. I think in the early days, there really was an optimism and there was a feeling, and the original mantra of Google was don't be evil. There was really a feeling that what we were providing was a technology that was helping people find information online. I shouldn't say none, I shouldn't say some of the externalities were not clear of what that would mean in terms of information bubbles that people might get put in, or the kinds of personalization, how it would draw people toward a particular kind of information. But there were things we saw early on at the time that we could see were problems with, say, overuse of personal data or trying to gather data in a very deep and rich sense, more than was necessary just for someone's search, at least what we thought at the time. And so there were some lines drawn in terms of how data was used, how data was gathered, the separation of advertising from the actual search engine in terms of what results you ranked highly to show to someone. So there were some of those issues identified early on, but I think what we saw over time is greater externalities. The fact that, online platforms would be used, say, for directing misinformation and disinformation toward people that would affect the outcome of elections was not something that we foresaw 15 years ago when we were working on the search engine. And I think what we've seen over time is that the combination of the technology that does this personalization, that pushes people towards seeing particular kinds of content that they would like to see, or they are more likely to click on, content that might be titillating, for example, or might be more extreme in its viewpoint, has shown us that some of these externalities do exist. They have real world impacts in elections in terms of information consumption and how people view themselves and each other. Now that those externalities are on display, becoming aware of them really brings up the question of what are the kinds of things we can do to address them. And that's not only something that needs to happen within the companies, but we need to think of more broadly societally, how would we like these companies to address them?
So Mehran, before I turn the floor over to Jeremy for some questions, I just want to have a quick follow-up there. For the vast majority of people whose lives are entangled with products, especially like Google's products, the search engine, YouTube, everything else. When you said just before that when you were there, we at Google didn't anticipate when in building Google search or the other products that people would use the tools for misinformation and disinformation in elections. Well, one response from might be, well, why not? Why was that one so hard to foresee? If you look back at history, misinformation and disinformation are hardly new. They've been around for a long, long time. Different information systems are deployed for those purposes. Was the idea that the people at Google were just optimistic not only about technology, but also optimistic about human nature, that people wouldn't do bad things with these beautiful new tools? Or where was the problem in foresight there?
Sure. I think one of the early foresight is you see where most of the problem seems to be at the time, and that's where you direct your attention. And so the greatest problem that we saw at the time was people trying to use misinformation for commercial interests, not for political interests. And so there was a large team there still is, even larger now, that works on, for example, trying to get what we would think of as spammy websites, right? Websites that are trying to rank highly in search results because they have some commercial interest. They want to sell you something, or they get some benefit if you click through to their site to view ads or whatever the case may be. And so given the strong commercial interest, there was a lot of focus placed on trying to tamp down information like that, which we could think of as a form of misinformation.
Yeah.
But the notion of having information directed toward people specifically to, say, influence the outcome of an election was not something that was on the radar back in 2002, 2005, that time period. And I think for a lot of people who are on the internet, that kind of information hadn't been weaponized yet. I think we really saw it weaponized in the 2016 election.
Yeah, so just like actually putting the language together here, you worked on these early email spam filtering tools, and so now we go on Google Mail and there's a spam auto filter box that we could sort through or just delete. And as you just put it, maybe that's a form of misinformation in the commercial sphere. Click on this for to give a bunch of money, or you've been chosen for some prize or whatever it turns out to be. And maybe we have a spammy information ecosystem now with misinformation and disinformation about COVID vaccines, about political affairs. And I don't know if it's helpful or not to think of cleaning up the information ecosystem with a sense of applying a spam-like framework from the commercial standpoint now to the broader information ecosystem. But all right, enough of my speculations there. Jeremy, over to you.
So one of the unique things about this book is that the three of us bring different disciplinary perspectives. Rob's the philosopher, I'm the social scientist and policymaker, Mehran is the technologist. And so I want to push a question over in your direction. Rob is the philosopher, right? The philosopher who shows up at a party and asks people hard questions and brings them down, or is seen as wagging a finger about what's moral and not moral. So how do you see the role of a philosopher in this conversation about technology's impact on society? And why is the right answer to the problems that we confront not simply bringing ethicists and philosophers into the tech industry as a chief ethics officer to kind of exercise this oversight role and make sure that we have less harm as a result of these products?
Yeah, great. Well, after being a teacher of philosophy for the past 20 years on campus, I'm familiar with the expectation often in a room, whether it's a seminar room or a dinner party atmosphere when the philosopher arrives. Just as you said, Jeremy, sometimes the expectation is, like the philosopher's here to wag the finger. We're going to be judged now, and it's time to embrace ourselves for the moral judgment that's going to be directed our way. Or like the moral expert, even worse, has arrived on the scene to give us tutoring about right and wrong behavior. And in the realm of technology, I think the familiar kind of background expectation is that when the ethicist arrives on the scene, the purpose is to slow everything down and to say, think a little bit harder and maybe don't do a whole bunch of the things that you're just doing to maximize the progress of science and technology. And, I want to try to set aside basically that entire set of expectations and begin a conversation both in the teaching I do on campus and in showing up in the world more generally that begins from a kind of simple proposition that, to my mind, is basically inescapable for any of us, which is that human life is shot full of moral complexity. And as human beings, we can either be awake to those moral complexities and to try to chart our way through it with a kind of excitement about what it means to be an agent in the world and to be forced to make a set of choices that are fundamentally choices about values. They're not technocratic choices in certain respects, but we're trying to figure out ways in order to interact with each other as simple human beings, as citizens within a society, or as professionals within a particular professional domain, in ways that sort of champion our equal moral basis or foreground our liberty or ways to produce diversity, or whatever it turns out to be. So the basic point here is that like ethics is inescapable. And we can either be asleep to that fact and sleepwalk through our lives, morally speaking, or we can be awake to that fact. And being awake simply means being energized to try to identify the relevant values that are at stake, and then to make arguments and justifications in ways that try to say, Jeremy, I'm trying to understand the values you're bringing to the table here. And Mehran, what are the values that are encoded within some of these technological tools or products or platforms? And then as we began with the book, at the moment, the values that technologists encode into their products and platforms are the value choices that are being imposed upon the rest of us at extraordinary scale. And that's what makes me think that a philosophical contribution to either a classroom environment with social scientists and technologists, or a book or a wider conversation is so important, because finally, Jeremy, I don't think the solution is appoint a chief ethics officer and that'll solve any problem. Ethics is all of our responsibility, or it's inescapable for all of us to accept some necessary confrontation with values. So to use the technology language here, you have to push ethics all the way down the stack. Everyone has to be empowered within a technology company, just as everyone's always empowered in their own lives to try to discuss, foreground, and argue on behalf of the value choices they're making, and that the company then should make as it develops its products.
So Rob, you brought up the value choices that come up with looking at different technologies. And there's this question of, well, whose values do you use? How do you think about that? And, Jeremy's had a lot of experience in public policy. So I'm wondering, Jeremy, from your perspective, how do you think we can actually address some of the problems that are on display in technology now? Things like the data that's being gathered about people, the information ecosystems we live in. Where do you think the directions for solutions lie?
So one of the things that struck me as I become more involved in this space over the last 5 years is just the extent to which most people look at the problems of big tech and feel profoundly disempowered. They see what's happening with technology and its effects on society as something that is in some sense fixed or preordained. It's like a wave that is washing over them and washing over society writ large. And part of what we try and do in our teaching, but also in this book, is sort of rediscover where agency exists in the system, so that if we don't like the outcomes that we're seeing, the social outcomes that we're seeing of technology, we understand where and how we can change these outcomes. And so I'll give you two particular areas of focus where I think there's real opportunity for agency. The first is in technology companies themselves, because ultimately, in the process of product design, as Rob described, implicit values are being encoded in the design of each technology. Let's take, for example, the creation of something like WhatsApp, right? Or Signal, an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform that enables us to communicate with one another in ways that no one else has access to. That puts a thumb on the scale for privacy as a preeminent and important value. But of course, privacy isn't the only value that we care about in society, as we've seen in the public policy debates around end-to-end encryption, that we might care about personal safety, we might care about national security, and ultimately figuring out how to balance our concern for privacy with these other values is what's at stake in every technological domain. So part of what we need in the tech sector, a healthy tech ecosystem, is one in which there's a practice around making explicit these value trade-offs, thinking about how to weigh them, not only in the context of a corporate environment, but thinking about who the broader stakeholders are, and making deliberate and intentional efforts to assess and measure harm and factor potential harm into the decisions about what products you build and also who those products are sold to. And we are at a moment where inside technology companies themselves, people are beginning to awaken to their agency and to think about how they use their power and influence as engineers, as product designers, right? As marketing and salespeople, people who are being actively competed over by the technology companies. And I'd call that the beginning of an ethic of responsibility in tech. And we know what an ethic of responsibility looks like in medicine or the life sciences, right? Or law, right? Where that's taken more formal and standardized forms over time. But we're just at the early stages of this in tech, and there's a lot of power inside tech itself to begin to address these issues in a different way. But then there's also power that exists outside of tech. And the most important locus of power that exists outside of tech is our politics. And what do I mean by our politics? I mean our democracy. And so when people say they don't like regulation, let's call it what it really is. They don't like democracy. They don't like the use of what we call one of the oldest technologies in the book, a political system, right? Which enables us to referee these value trade-offs so we can figure out how to live together when we have different preferences. And our politics is the second place where we can really deal with these harmful effects. And of course, we use the language externality intentionally because when you think about the externalities in our environment as a result of private sector behavior, you naturally think about the role of the state in dealing with those potential consequences, realigning incentives for the private sector. And so government is the second arena of action. And the book goes through a whole set of examples, some very specific and focused. How do we think about what a national federal privacy law would look like? What would it mean to bring transparency and accountability to the use of algorithms to make important decisions in our lives, whether in the private sector or the public sector? How do we think about the consequences of AI and automation for displacement in the workforce? And what are the arenas for government engagement? So there are all sorts of spaces where our democratic politics has an important role to play, and citizens need to have a voice in that process. But we also need to build a set of democratic institutions that are capable of governing technology. And that means thinking very hard about what kind of expertise is attracted into government, but also how we build institutions that are much more flexible and adaptable. Because right now we're in a cycle where harms are realized, but action doesn't follow for 15 or 20 or 25 years. And that's obviously not a level of responsiveness that's really going to enable us as a society to amplify the benefits and mitigate the harms of technology as we see it unfold.
Well, so let me ask one more follow-up there about that last point, and Mehran or Jeremy hop in on this. How do we build from a human capital standpoint, or perhaps an institutional design standpoint, the capacity of government agencies, of democratic capacity to handle the accelerating pace of technological and scientific change? You know, at least in our neck of the woods in Silicon Valley, the idea that people would get a computer science degree and imagine a career pathway that involves long stints in government, that's a rare thing. So Jeremy, since you served two-year terms in the Obama administration in different capacities, maybe you want to tackle that first. Like, what now from your perch at a university, or thinking more broadly about the world, are the necessary ways of developing the human capacity, as well as then whatever institutional design changes need to be made for this more flexible and adaptive regulatory arrangement?
So, I mean, two things I'd say at the outset, just to get the conversation going. The first is that if you look at our political institutions and our government and say it doesn't have the technical expertise that it needs to govern the technological present or the technological future, you have to recognize that that's a choice that we've made, right? It's not something that is fixed by the very design of government. And part of the story that we tell in the book is one about the evisceration and the decline of scientific expertise in government. Thinking back to the 1980s, the role of this little institution that was a part of Congress called the Office of Technology Assessment, that played a fundamental role in challenging the kind of scientific foundation or basis for Ronald Reagan's strategic defense initiative, Star Wars, the land-based missiles in space initiative that we think back to in the 1980s. And it was a set of scientists empowered in the policymaking process who raised questions about the viability of what was a budget-busting kind of Cold War policy proposal by the Reagan administration. we destroyed that institution. That is, in our effort to scale back and roll back the regulatory state over the 1980s and into the 1990s, we disincentivized and in fact wound down institutions just like the Office of Technology Assessment. So it hasn't always been this way, which is also a signal that it doesn't always need to be this way. And just one example, this is the second point, coming from the Obama administration. There was an effort in the Obama administration to recognize that career trajectories, if we want to attract tech talent into government, shouldn't be thought of as linear, right? And the Federal Civil Service is built around linear career trajectories, that people graduate from undergraduate or graduate school and they go into the Federal Civil Service and they stay in it for their entire career. But actually, bringing in technical talent means figuring out ways to attract people in with the relevant expertise, to have them there for critically important moments, and then to enable them to go back into the technology sector, to allow for this real cycling. And the Obama administration created something called the US Digital Service, which was an effort to create these far more flexible and responsive pathways into government. That needs to be scaled up so dramatically. That was a tiny experiment in whether this could be done, whether there would be demand for this kind of expertise in federal agencies, and also a supply of technologists willing to do this kind of work. And the answer was yes to both of those things. But the question is, how do we infuse our entire architecture of the Federal Civil Service with that same kind of mentality? Maybe Mehran can offer some thoughts on the student side, or even more broadly about how you think we build this momentum to technologists serving in the public interest.
Yeah, I think the fact that you mentioned the US Digital Service is a great example of both nonlinear career paths, because it's something that people can rotate into for a year or two as part of another career. And that was, a popular way, actually, it still is, to get folks from Silicon Valley involved in government sort of more broadly in terms of building technology that's useful for citizens, but also providing technical expertise. And I think that's one of the things we need to see, both from the standpoint of students who are thinking about the impact that they can have with a career in technology. I think the story's been written too much about the only way you can have an impact is, say, to go out into industry and have some company that changes how the world thinks about technology. And the truth is that, some of the things we've actually seen in that regard haven't been so positive for the world. But there's lots of ways to have impact, to think about what are ways that we can have reasonable policies that govern the technology that we all have to interact with, and ways that we can actually build technology for government to allow for people to be able to access services, for example, that would make things better for everyone from a civil standpoint. So I think there are career paths there. There are things that we're seeing more students go into. And I think it's something that the story needs to be told more of both the opportunities to get involved that way, but the real need that exists for technical expertise to get involved in the policymaking process and in the development of the technological expertise in Washington.
Let me add one more thing to that too, if I can. My own career pathway 30 years ago involved getting an undergraduate degree in philosophy and then learning about this brand new program that has just been announced called Teach for America. How could we get people who are graduating who didn't get a certification in elementary or secondary public school teaching, but we're interested in answering a call to a certain form of national service to go serve for 2 years as a teacher in an under-resourced and understaffed public school. I signed up for that in the early days. And one of the amazing things about Teach for America now, looking back 30 years later, is how successful it turned out to be at getting people who had newly minted undergraduate degrees to sign on for at least a temporary career pathway that involved, basically saying no to much more, higher social status jobs and higher paydays. So Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, used to say that Teach for America will really be successful when a graduate of university applies for a job at Wall Street or at a management consulting firm and at Teach for America and chooses not to do the management consulting job or Wall Street job, instead goes to TFA. And for a while, she was successful there. I don't think TFA has quite the same standing on college campuses as it used to. It also has various problems with the whole model of 2 years of teaching. But setting that aside, the basic spirit of this is I'd love to see a kind of renewed effort of, rebranding or reconfiguring the call for technically skilled young people or early professionals to spend, a civil service tour of duty in a public agency where it becomes a sort of badge of social honor or status to have done so. And we have things like Code for America that are early versions of this. And I just think we need many more of them. And TFA proves in a certain respect that it's possible to do that, even at pretty significant scale.
Let me ask, I know we're going to open it up to audience questions in a couple minutes, but maybe another question I'll throw in your direction, Rob. You've heard us talk so far a fair bit about the role of democracy, the need to exercise agency and voice. You're a theorist of democracy, a philosopher of democracy. People don't have a lot of faith in democracy right now. This is a model of government that maybe has seen better days in some people's perspective. And I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts thinking back over democracy's history, right? And the origins of these kinds of ideas about how we govern ourselves, about how we summon faith and renew our energy in these institutions, given the polarization and dysfunction that are all around us. Of course, that's not unique to making progress on tech, but because we think democracy is so central to making progress on tech, maybe you can shed some light on this.
Yeah, great. Well, the invitation to offer some thoughts about the history of democracy and democratic theory could very easily tempt me into a kind of capsule overview about millennia-long experiments in democracy.
That's not what I was asking.
I know. I'm going to refrain from that, but I'm going to pick up the language of experimentation there. Like democratic theorists or people who study democracies will often try to offer up different justifications for what either makes democracy special or a case on behalf of why it's the most important or best form of government, as opposed to other kinds of political organization, dictatorships, autocracies, technocratic ways of organizing society. And I want to fixate for myself on the language of experimentation. I view democracies as a particular form of social organization in representative democracies with periodic elections in which representatives are held accountable to the public or to citizens through electoral mechanisms and beyond, as ways of forming ongoing social experiments in public problem solving. So in principle, what makes democracies a recommendable form of government is that they're always adaptable and updated. Oh yeah, we passed that law 10 years ago, but social conditions have changed and the old solution doesn't seem to meet the needs of the day. So we can either unelect the people who screwed it up or weren't sufficiently foresightful and have some new people to try again, or we as citizens can bring our own power to bear in various ways to try to force through various types of social pressure the current representatives to do things in a different way. That's just the garden variety give and take in a democratic society that in principle makes it an ongoing experiment in social problem solving, where all of us have to imagine that we have the agency to express our voices in different local, state, national, even global forums to try to get our elected representatives to do things in different ways. Finally, I'll just add, one of the people I studied early on when I was in graduate school and still make reference to all the time, the American pragmatic philosopher John Dewey, wrote about public school settings as well as just ordinary local neighborhoods as themselves experiments in democracy. People get to do things together in school and acquire the habits of being active and participatory citizens or agents in their own collective self-making. And the more and more that we as citizens become passive agents, we just sit back and passively evaluate the world around us, and once in a while go press a button in an electoral box, and that's the only form of participation that seems relevant to us, that hollows out this kind of habit of active participation in democracies. And so, I'll hitch this then to the core message of our book, which is about highlighting and raising the agency of all of us, whether as users of technologies, as citizens in a democracy, as professionals in a company, as investors, as founders, wherever you happen to sit, and you have multiple locations in all of this. Exercising your agency individually and collectively is just part of what a healthy fabric of democratic societies looks like. And that's ever more necessary now in an age in which technology just seems to happen to us. But as you said, Jeremy, and as we say in the book all the time, it does not need to be that way.
Well, maybe to take that thought then and turn to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. One of the most recent questions that was asked is, what can individual citizens outside of the industry do to best advocate for the overhaul of big tech's priorities? So maybe to start with Jeremy on this, what do you think that individuals can do?
So I guess I'd approach answering that question in a couple ways. The first is that, at the core is educating yourself about these new technologies and the values that are at stake. We're at a moment where it's easy to read the headlines and to understand that there's a problem, but not really to understand what the problem is, to make sense of where the power rests to produce a different outcome. And people really need to do the homework and understand what's happening in the social media landscape, what's happening with automation and its consequences for our workforce, what it means to have algorithms making decisions about hiring, credit scores, and the like. And so that's part of why we do our teaching. That's part of why we've written this book. And ultimately, we think it's a conversation that needs to get outside of Silicon Valley, but it also needs to get outside of Washington. Because again, the focus that we put on democracy in the book means that it's a conversation that needs to involve all of us in such important ways. The second thing is that people actually have a lot of agency that they're not yet taking advantage of as consumers. And that's partly because there are tremendous asymmetries of power built into the relationship that we have with technologies. Think about the things that you need to click through, to give permission to companies to do all sorts of things with your data. These things are unreadable, they're written in legalese, you're anxious to download your application, you are inclined when you open your laptop to use whatever platforms are already made available to you, and all of those reflect corporate incentives, but maybe aren't best placed to position you to effectuate your own preferences, whether those preferences are about privacy or the kind of information that you want to have access to, the extent you want to be protected from information that might not be valid or might be categorized as disinformation. And so ultimately, there are steps you can take in terms of your privacy settings, in terms of the applications that you choose, and lots of help guides online to help you make those choices if you want to. But I think the biggest point is that in each of our roles, whether you're an educator, whether you're a technologist who's building technology, whether you're an investor who allocates money behind companies, the one role that all of us share is that we're citizens of a political community. And we are at a moment where those that we elect to make decisions on our behalf have to understand how important we think it is to address these social externalities. And voting isn't going to be enough in terms of communicating the importance of these issues. People need to be speaking about them in their book group, in their neighborhood, with other parents where you send your kids to school if you're concerned about social media's harmful effects on children, and communicating those desires and demands to our elected politicians, because that set of political institutions that we have is how we exercise influence. And you need to imagine the counterfactual. In fact, we've lived through the counterfactual, which is that when our democracy is not in the game, we've basically outsourced all of this decision-making to those people who build technologies and those who finance the companies that create technologies. And that's what's gotten us into the situation that we're in now. Why don't we go over to our, go ahead to ask other audience questions. Yeah.
Fantastic. We have one from an audience member saying, do you think we can blame or partially blame big tech for the current political polarization we have now?
That's a great example of a widely held view that has, in principle, a social scientific answer to it. That's what makes, I think, the interesting combination of our collaboration important. Jeremy, why don't you say a little bit about the evidence to date, and then Mehran, maybe I'll just stimulate you to mention the assignment we use in the class and briefly talk about in the book.
So the social scientific answer is in part, but not, the dominant driver of the polarization that we confront today. Some of the kind of key pieces of evidence that speak to this, if you look at where polarization among Americans has increased the most, either kind of general polarization on party lines or what social scientists call affective polarization, which is when it's no longer that we disagree about policy matters, but because you're of a different political party, I don't even like you. I don't want you to marry into my family. Just that's what affective polarization is. Polarization is the greatest and has seen the greatest increase among people over the age of 65, right? Those are people who are the least active users of new technologies. And so it makes you begin to think, well, then, okay, what might be the drivers of some of this polarization, beyond the moment that we're in with respect to technology? And the role of television, the role of Fox News, the role of Sinclair Broadcasting. People have been very interested in the role that media has played, but social media came a lot later than the opening up of cable news and the ability of cable news as we moved away from 3 broadcast networks with a pretty standardized news consumption diet, have been a critical part of the polarization of mass publics. And of course, the most extreme polarization has really begun with elites, right? Seeing a real difference between the political parties, that it took a generation for that to begin to be felt among the general public at large. So the answer is yes, in part, because we now see these polarization dynamics among politicians and among individuals playing out online and being amplified to large numbers of people in a way that probably reinforces existing trends. But a lot of those trends really began before social media was being created.
And just to add to that briefly, what I'd say is, the technology has really created an amplification effect. So there's other drivers, as Jeremy mentioned, of what creates polarization. But then when you think about trying to optimize for someone's information diet, you tend to give them more of the kinds of things they've looked at before. So if they've already taken a particular slant, that technology will tend to amplify that slant over time. And we actually give an assignment in our class related to this, where we set up a simple social network simulation where half of the people in the simulation tend to be slightly leaning toward left-leaning outlets for news, and the other half of the network is right-leaning users who have a slightly right-leaning diet in terms of the information they look at. And then we have a knob that the students can turn, which is basically how much you're trying to optimize on click-through rate versus information diversity. And if you try to maximize click-through rate, which is going to generate the most revenue for the social network, what you actually get is that basically the social network breaks in 2 halves. You have the right-leaning users on one side who are sharing information, the left-leaning users on the other who are sharing information, and very little crosstalk. And it's an example of the kind of amplification that happens as a result of doing something that might seem innocuous within the company, which is just we're trying to generate more revenue, or we're trying to get greater engagement on content or click-through, but it actually has this externality where it creates these echo chambers and amplifies the directions in which people already have a proclivity to head.
All right. So here's an interesting one. Zuckerberg is introducing the metaverse. Do you foresee this being harmful or beneficial, or do you have any other predictions for what it might be like and how it might affect technology going forward?
Well, if I can give a couple thoughts about the metaverse, you think, at one level, it's an attempt at control. Because if you think about the fact that the metaverse is a place where we would live, that's not just about now information we post textually or a meme or a picture that we post, but is an actual environment that we live in, It's an opportunity for one company to have an outsized ownership of our online living space. And living space, in some sense, becomes a very literal metaphor because it's not just about one aspect of our lives. It becomes a much more encompassing aspect of our lives. There's many more facets of what we do, the kinds of things we like, who we interact with, that can be tracked there. The other thing, just at a personal level for me, when I think about a metaverse is it's escapist, right? We have a lot of real problems in the real world. Why not spend even more time online not dealing with those problems? So it has, it really smacks of one company trying to take greater ownership and greater control over more aspects of our lives, while at the same time getting us to spend less time dealing with real issues that exist in the physical world.
All right, here's another one to kind of follow that. Are there any figures in big tech that come to mind who are effectively centering ethics in their work or making a good faith attempt to do so?
I'll start on that one. I think we all will have some answers for that. Coincidentally, just this morning, Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was one of the leading AI ethicists employed by Google, was fired from Google exactly a year ago. She announced this morning that she's creating a new AI ethics institute or research outfit to try to steer the future of artificial intelligence in ways that will be far more beneficial than has been the case in current industry settings, for example. And I guess I just point to the fact that it's not at all an accident that women and minorities have often led the way in identifying some of the harms from technological tools, products, and platforms, because they're so typically underrepresented in the product development life cycle, in the investment community, in the leadership C-suites of tech companies, that as these tools reach extraordinary numbers of users, they have disproportionate or diverse effects on different populations, often having negative or harmful effects on minority populations. And so it's been women and minorities who have often surfaced some of these harms in the most brutal and honest ways that have seemed to people to have either been unintended, or now that they've been pointed out, we have to backtrack and reconfigure some of the tools. Facial recognition is a really good example of this. Joy Buolamwini is another, fantastic person who has centered ethics at the core of her work. She just finished her PhD at MIT, now has an entity called the Algorithmic Justice League, which attempts to do more of this. And I'm sure Jeremy and Mehran could give some other examples.
Yeah, so there are some companies too that have taken different business models. So they place a different kind of emphasis on issues like privacy. So if you look at a company like DuckDuckGo as a search engine that tries to collect minimal amounts of information about you as an alternative to what you might get in other platforms online. Perhaps most tellingly, recently Sridhar Ramaswamy, who is the senior vice president for the entire ads platform at Google, left and created a new company, Neva, which is a search engine that doesn't actually gather personal information to have an advertising-based model. Instead, it uses a subscription-based model. So if you care about having your information tracked and you think it has value, you can go to a different search engine, right, that provides for you a different value proposition as a way of rebalancing what values they think are worthwhile.
The one thing I'd add on this is just to say the two examples that Mehran gave from inside companies are important because these represent different business models. Not the appointment of a chief ethicist, not simply the adoption of a set of ethical principles to guide their work, but like the rubber meets the road on, are you willing to trade off competing values or the mitigation of potential social harms in various forms against your bottom line by pursuing alternative ways of structuring your organization, your business, the proposition that you offer to consumers. And so people should be looking at companies and looking for evidence that they're taking ethics seriously, but not be blinded by simply the adoption of principles or the appointment of individuals who have responsibility for ethics, because everyone is going to do that now. We're at a moment where a company that doesn't have that is sending too negative a signal in the market, but having those things on their own won't be evidence of having made different choices. So we need to look beneath the surface to really understand to what extent these commitments are leading to changes in behavior.
Great. We only have a couple more, but I think this is a good follow-up to that. Will these problems become more fixable with further regulation, or will that have the opposite effect? I think they mean government regulation.
So I think we have to recognize, what regulation is good for and what it's not good for. So regulation, the framework that we offer in the book is kind of a guardrails approach to democracy. We recognize that democracy is slow, it's deliberate, and it's slow and deliberate for intentional reasons, right? It's the arena in which we referee these value trade-offs and deal with the fact that we have to live together, even though we may want very different things out of the world. And what that means is that democracy, when it acts, is going to act later, and it's going to act to address the kind of most consequential harms that are out there. And so I think we can expect to see over the next 5 or 10 years, we think of this as a policy window, we're going to see regulatory action. We're going to see regulatory action on privacy. We're going to see regulatory action around social media and children in particular. I think we're going to see regulatory action around data portability that gives consumers an ability to move from one platform to another and to take their data with them. I hope we'll see regulatory and government action around AI and its distributional consequences on the workforce, especially for low income and sort of poorly educated workers. We may even see some regulatory action on the competitiveness of the marketplace. And those things, I think, will address the harms of the last 15 years, right? But what government isn't terribly good at is foresight. And that's partly because, but neither are technology companies. They're not terribly good at foresight either. And so part of what we call for in the book is the cultivation of this ethical practice in tech companies so that there's much more active experimentation and learning before technologies are rolled out at scale and even as they're rolled out at scale. And that's going to be the work not just of government, but of companies themselves. And so we've got to see the effort to mitigate these harms as a partnership.
All right, we have one final question. This one's kind of interesting. As co-authors, are there any points on which you disagree?
Yes, of course. Many points of disagreement, and productive disagreement at that. I'll share just a story about the process of writing the book here as a way of answering that in more specifics. On a couple of occasions when either in the process of writing the book and talking about it to people before it had come out or after it had come out, people will sometimes ask me, it hasn't happened a lot, but a few times someone will say, all right, 3 of you who wrote the book, which one of you actually did the writing? As if a genuine collaboration amongst the 3 of us on the writing wasn't possible. How did you get one voice on the page if it wasn't just one person with the pen? And we spent, before we wrote the book, 3 years teaching a class together in which we encountered each other's voices all the time in the classroom. We had to construct the syllabus, and that was a whole year-long process of working with each other. And so we really came to understand where we had a common framework and where there were productive points of disagreement. And then the writing process took shape with a very detailed outline of every single chapter. One or the other of us had, the first pen on a particular section, then we rotated through each other for edits in order to get to a point where we had a single voice. And in particular, in the writing process, we would surface some points of disagreement, often not major ones, but points of emphasis. Or, for example, did we want to consider whether the First Amendment, and in a kind of absolutist stance on freedom of expression in the United States, is a problem, or should we just take that as a fixed point in our analysis that we're not going to repeal the First Amendment or amend the First Amendment? Or what do we really think about antitrust approaches? Antitrust approaches are now, quite popular in terms of early forms of regulatory approaches. It's unclear what effect they'll have. Did we want to fully endorse the idea of breaking up companies? Did we want to be against antitrust approaches? And there were modest points of disagreement on topics like those. I think the good part of this is, while that's not necessarily a productive thing to air out in a book, in the classroom, productive disagreement is often interesting and stimulating for students then to engage as well.
All right. Any final words, y'all? We have, we're out of time at this point, but this has been a fantastic conversation. Any final thoughts?
Well, just a thought around agency for the people who are listening and paying attention to these kind of issues to get involved and continue to be involved, because we need everyone's voices if we want to get to a place where we really see better outcomes in the tech sector.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for being here and giving us your time and giving us this fantastic talk. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you to everyone who's watching from home and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. Check out the links in the chat if you'd like to purchase a copy of System Error. It's fantastic. You won't regret it. Please remember to shop indie and shop local, especially as the holidays are coming up. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, have a great rest of your day and be well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.